we have James and James in the first panel. So I'll just briefly read out a biog for both Jameses and then invite them to come and give their presentations. So Dr. James Rose. James Rose is a Senior Research Fellow with the Indigenous Studies Unit at the Melbourne School of Population and Global Health at the University of Melbourne, where he coordinates the Indigenous Data Network. James specialises in large-scale forensic population modelling, social and kinship network analysis, geographic information systems and relational database systems design and implementation. Dr. Rose holds degrees in population health, social anthropology and visual art. He has over 15 years' experience working for Indigenous controlled organisations across urban and remote southeast, central and northern Queensland, Australia, in areas of native title, population health and cultural heritage preservation. Please welcome James. I'll just sit there, James. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. It's going to be interesting without a PowerPoint. I can't see mine either. Is it here? Is it supposed to be here? Because without it, I'm probably going to talk for too long. Before we begin, it's a pity that we don't have representatives of the Ngunnawal people here still. I worked in native title for 15 years as a forensic anthropologist, providing evidence to the federal court. One of the last research projects that I worked on was in fact in this region, so I'm quite familiar with the traditional owners of this area. So having said that, oh fantastic, thanks Kylie.
No worries.
Lovely.
I'll be your techie as well.
Great, a bit of a step down. Having said that, I would like to take a moment to very seriously thank the Ngunnawal people, but also all Indigenous Australians who really have paid a tremendous price in the history of this country's last 230 years of development, and are the reason that I'm here today. Having said that, I'd like to acknowledge the co-conveners, ARDC, the Academy and DARIAH. And thirdly, I'd like to acknowledge Professor Marcia Langton, who founded the Indigenous Data Network at the Indigenous Studies Unit at Melbourne, and her steering committee, which is made up of some of Australia's leading academics, particularly in health, leading Indigenous academics, but in other areas as well. So the Indigenous Data Network straddles an interesting two different areas of research, both medical and humanities, and a lot of the work that I do is involved in trying to bridge those two worlds. So I don't see that there is any inherent division between humanities and science, or art and science in particular. And I work very much in that consilience space. That's where I come from. I started off training in visual arts and I've wound up in medicine. So, the title of my paper is Data Sovereignty in a Colonial Context Towards an Integrated National Governance Framework for Australia. The way that I like to present my papers is by organising motivation, a goal and a strategy so that there is some coherence in the way we move through quite complex subject matter together as both a speaker and audience. It's a pity that you can't see it, so I'll just quickly outline that. The motivation for the establishment of the Indigenous Data Network in the medical faculty at the Indigenous Studies Unit in Melbourne is inequality. Inequality in access to and control of data between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians, and there are historical reasons for this, which I'm going to go into as we progress through this paper. The goal is the establishment of a federated national Indigenous controlled entity for regulating that access and control. So the Indigenous Data Network has a long-term vision for what we want to see change in the Australian domain, data management domain. And we have a equivalently long and sophisticated strategy for how we intend to go about that. That strategy is made up of a series of concurrent tactical steps, the first step of which is a contribution to the standardisation of terms and definitions for this conversation that we're going to be having, which is going to be quite difficult, as we know, because of the colonial context in which we are working. The purpose of this paper is a first shot in that contribution. So, data sovereignty in a colonial context, the title of my paper incorporates the three key terms and definitions that I'd like to address today. So we have data, we have sovereignty, and we have a colonial context, or as I like to say, colonialism with an Australian flavour. So let's start with data. What do we mean by data? For the IDN, we mean the product of work. Data is the product of intellectual work, and in particular it's the product of semogenetic work. It's a term from linguistics and semiotics which means the construal of meaning, the realisation of meaning. From our perspective, data is a tertiary product from a three-phase chain, a production chain, which commences with matter and energy. So if you talk to a physicist or a chemist, they'll talk about matter and energy encoding information. Right? From the perspective of linguists and semioticians, they talk about matter and energy of human beings realising meaning from matter and energy. And what they mean by that is that we come equipped as a species with a range of sensory powers, including the capacity to detect certain wavelengths of light, which we call a visible spectrum, certain changes in air pressure, which we call hearing, certain perturbations in electrical fields, which we call touch, and so on and so forth. What we do as a species that makes us so distinct is that we bring to this experience, this sensory repertoire, language. And language is a universal capacity of our species. It's very, very sophisticated. It has universal traits which allow us to convert matter and energy into this thing that we call meaning. It's spectacularly powerful. And it is, in fact, the basis for our social sophistication. So I say, as a social anthropologist, the immense complexity of our various social cultures derives from the power of language to construe meaning from sensory inputs. So the first product from that semogenetic work that we do is information. So we take our experience of matter and energy, we're very, very complicated, we use our very sophisticated language to produce information. Once we have information, what we do is we specialise. We specialise varieties of language for different realms of experience. So we divide our worlds up into domains of experience. We experience music, we experience astronomy, we experience poetry, art, biology, physics, and no matter which culture that we might be members of, you will encounter specialised variations of languages in that culture for talking about different realms of experience. We might think about it in a more familiar sense in terms of the academy, where we have specialised branches of knowledge, specialised branches of investigation, which have highly formalised languages. Now, where data comes into it as a tertiary product is, in a developmental sense, a kind of refining of our own consciousness, our own recognition of that specialisation in language. Data refer to characteristic attributes from each specialised language. So data emerges once we have the capacity to recognise that there are recurrent characteristic features of each specialised language which we can predict to occur in a patterned way over time, such that we can count them. So data is really a byproduct of the mainstreaming of mathematical formalisation. It's very important to recognise that. So one of my unfortunate experiences as a fine arts student was this kind of rejection of formal modelling, which is bizarre because really there's no difference between the formalisation of the specialised language that we have for talking about art and the formalised language that we have for talking about, say, the movement of proteins around an organic system. Okay? So data is the interaction between the formal capacity to count attributes and also to classify characteristic attributes from different specialised languages. Okay. From the perspective of the IDN, Indigenous data is the tertiary product of Indigenous intellectual work. So this is work that is done by Indigenous people specifically because of their distinct experiences working with the millennia, tens of thousands of years of intergenerational experiences in this country in particular, but in other countries as well, where there is a distinction between an Indigenous and a non-Indigenous population, such that the specialised languages that are developed are very, very discrete. They're very, very distinct. When we talk about Indigenous data, we're talking about data that refers specifically to Indigenous information, which is a product of Indigenous experiences. It's a property. It's an asset class. So data is an intangible asset. Beyond zooming back out into a generic definition again, it is now widely recognised that there is a market referred to as the data economy. It became unavoidable to acknowledge after the emergence of Web 2.0, which is the online universe that we experience in social media and online retail work. It is hugely profitable until very recently was unregulated. So the profit margins of companies such as Twitter, Facebook, Amazon and so forth were made possible because there were no regulatory frameworks to rein them in. And to this day, in fact, their sophisticated ability to avoid taxation is second to none. So in 2011, acknowledging this emerging phenomena, the World Economic Forum issued a report defining data as an emergent asset class, an intangible asset, which could be quantified. It's entirely possible to quantify and attach a value to data. Then subsequent to that, they placed it, just for emphasis, on par with other forms of tangible capital, tangible assets such as capital, real estate and infrastructure. No different, no different. Then the International Accounting Standards Board, International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation introduced a standard for the IFRS that was Standard 38, which defines data as a resource. It's a different term for the same thing, as in an asset, controlled by an entity as a result of past events, by which they mean past work. Past events, and from which future economic benefits are expected to flow to that entity. And this is very dry, but I'm going to bring it back into the colonial context in a second, which hopefully will be a bit more exciting. Last year, the European Union introduced the General Data Protection Regulation, which leveraged the definitions and the standardisations that had been introduced previously by the WEF and other international regulatory bodies to basically require participants in Web 2.0, such as Facebook, Twitter and others, to create data asset registries. There were no registries. These organisations had no regulatory pressure to keep records of the data they were collecting from people. The data that people were generating as a sort of form of free labour, the result of free labour, basically. This is where the profit of these companies comes from. Users are providing work for nothing, basically. So in a colonial context in Australia, what is colonisation? For our purposes at the IDN, colonisation describes a unilateral asset transfer, okay? Also known as theft. So what happens in a colonial economic development process is that you will have an exogenous entity, to use the International Financial Regulatory Board's terms, arrive and they will alienate assets in a domain over which they assert a jurisdictional mandate. In this case, it was the British government. They arrived, they asserted radical title over the continent of Australia and they seized all assets via that deed, which included most obviously the landmass of Australia, but then also the resources contained within that landmass and also the people, which includes all of the intellectual work that those people had done. Okay, so we're going to work our way towards this. They alienated land, natural resources, labour, physical labour, which many of you in the space would be aware of. In Australia, this is referred to as stolen wages, the stolen wages phenomenon. In other parts of the world, it's referred to as slavery. Okay, and the British also alienated information in terms of the location of water, which they needed very much in the first stages of the colonisation of this country, but also very strategic assets such as pathways through impenetrable terrain. So they alienated information, and they did this by force. The alienation of data came later in the refining of the colonial administration of this country. And it came in the last 2 decades before the British Colonial Office transferred administration of Australia to the new Australian Commonwealth, which is now the heir of the colonial administration of this country. And the capacity to collect data, to alienate data from Indigenous people, arose because just as with the specialisation of other kinds of language in other realms of experience, the colonial authorities in this country began to develop a specialised language for talking about Indigenous peoples, which later came to be called social anthropology. But initially, what they did was develop a sort of a framework, a specialised language for collecting information about the distribution of Aboriginal populations, Indigenous populations, collecting information about the variations in language, in cultural practices, in economic practices, including whether people were hunters or gatherers or fishers or practitioners of agriculture and aquaculture and so forth. And they used this to control Indigenous populations because really the main goal was to prevent the involvement of Indigenous people in the governance and economy of this country. Initially, Indigenous people were a majority, and they posed a real and immediate threat to the British ability to control this particular jurisdiction. So the language of colonial administration eventually turned into what we now call social anthropology, and in the early 20th century began to be taught in the academy. My alma mater, where I did my first postgrad degree in social anthropology, was Sydney University, and that university instituted the chair of the founding chair of social anthropology with Radcliffe Brown. And nothing's changed since. My first job when I graduated was to work with the Northern Territory government as a social anthropologist, and it was basically an administrative role for administering, regulation of Indigenous communities. I don't do that anymore, thankfully. I'm a recovering social anthropologist. Okay, so now we get to sovereignty. Yeah. What does sovereignty mean in this context? So we'll just very quickly touch on a generic definition of sovereignty. It is the asserted mandate of an entity to regulate the existence of a population in a particular domain. So whether it's an abstract domain, such as an online domain, or whether it's a physical one, such as a continent, the principle is the same. That's what sovereignty means in a generic sense. What sovereignty means for Indigenous people in this country is a little bit different. There were no treaties in this country, so there is no formal mechanism by which Indigenous people may exercise any kind of discrete sovereignty, discrete from that asserted by the Australian Commonwealth. And this applies to data as well. Now, there is a special caveat which I need to mention, which is manifest in the Federal Native Title Act, which was a piece of legislation introduced in 1993 as a result of a very important federal court decision about whether the Australian Commonwealth had the power to encompass Indigenous property rights in this country. And this is important for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it sets a precedent by which a degree of very limited sovereignty might be recognised, and by sovereignty I mean property rights, the capacity to exercise a mandate. But important also because in 1993 there was no internet, really, for popular purposes. There certainly wasn't any Web 2.0, and there certainly wasn't any GDPR, the European Union's data protection regulation. So there is no element of that legislation which really gives consideration to how Indigenous data might be managed. So we're left with a bit of a power vacuum there. The Indigenous Data Network really is seeking to take control of that vacuum, to organise it, but to bypass the very litigious and very expensive and very inefficient mechanisms that the Native Title Act uses for tangible property, including real estate and natural resources, to restore Indigenous control of data about Indigenous people. And just as a quick aside, we don't see there being any distinction between data about people and data generated by people. Any data that regards people is inherently the product of those people's intellectual work. So it doesn't matter whether information or data collected about Indigenous people was done by government, by anthropologists, universities, archives, or whomever. It's the product of Indigenous work. It belongs to those people. The IDN's vision for how we can conduct, how that restoration might be implemented, is not by a centralisation, but rather by a networking of existing repositories and the establishment of a federated governance framework that leverages off existing governance structures that you find in land councils, prescribed bodies, corporate and other established Indigenous controlled entities around the country. This is a quite complicated endeavour, as you might imagine. The IDN provides two streams of service to try and facilitate this exercise. One is technical, so actually implementing the technological infrastructure to be able to link together existing collections where those collections are limited to information only and have not yet been transformed into that tertiary product, data. We provide expertise that will make that possible. And we also provide training, and we have a three-tiered training framework, which includes the technical training for Indigenous computer experts, population health experts and so on. We have training for data collection and modelling, and we have training for those organisations who already have those issues taken care of in governance and how they might better comply with the aspirations of Indigenous controlled organisations in creating that federation. I really look forward to questions. There's a lot that I can imagine people have. So thanks for your time.
Maybe we'll take a few now, and then at the end of James's paper, James Smithies' paper, we'll take some together. So okay. Any immediate questions to James Rice? Thank you for a fascinating and wonderful presentation. Yeah. Really highlighting some major issues around Indigenous data, and we need to hear more of that and do more of it. Got any immediate questions for James? Just on the federated program or attempt to try and federate, I mean, surely that would be the greatest challenge you have to try and coordinate and bring together that material across the country. I mean, at the moment, is it rather patchy?
It's extremely patchy. So we describe the siloing of data as in terms of orphan data sets. So we have, I know from personal experience that some of the most important ethnographic work that was conducted throughout the 20th century is held in almost unknown repositories, some of which are in an appalling state, in various university archives around the country. There are some here in the National Library that I've worked with, which are currently being digitised, which is great. But in terms of transforming, just digitised bits of paper into information that Indigenous people can actually exert some control over, let alone then transform it into data, which has much more powerful applications in the services of health, education, justice, service engagement, so on and so forth. There's quite a lot of work to be done. We're fortunate enough that there is already a very strong Indigenous level of control in those sectors, in education, in law, and health, and so that's what we're trying to focus on.
Thank you. We've got one up back there, and then got one down here. So.
Hi James, thanks very much. A really thought-provoking presentation. It's kind of along the lines of that first question, but the objective was inequality, and that gives you a very, very broad scope of things to collect data about. Do you have any particular first areas where there's a particular objective, and because the kind of objective would always inform what information you're collecting and how and for what purpose?
I mean, there are many urgent examples. If I think about the ethnographic collections that are held here in the National Library, one collection that's very close to me because it overlaps, it affects the communities that I've spent decades working for, is the field notes of a proto-anthropologist, or what we might call an ethnographer, who worked from the late 19th century through the early part of the 20th, and was a fluent Wiradjuri language speaker, was participating in religious ceremonies, was recording a level of detail about people's identities, their economic cultures and so forth that was not happening anywhere else in the country at that time. It's absolutely priceless information, and his field notes are direct records of the conversations that he was having with Indigenous elders at that time. So in my native title work as a forensic anthropologist, we've used that data to reconstruct the entire Indigenous population of Southeast Australia. Now, there are two data sets in that little anecdote. One are the field notes, which anybody can walk in and access. They're original paper versions, which are sitting here, which I find mind-blowing. It's not anybody's fault necessarily, but it should not be the case, and it's sort of mind-blowing they're only just being digitised now. The other aspect of that anecdote, well, and look, I need to say that the vast majority of Indigenous people whose ancestors are recorded in those field notes don't even know of their existence, right? So really you're talking about primarily non-Indigenous researchers such as myself who currently have access and control as against, right, the descendants of the people actually documented in those records. The other element of that anecdote relates to the population modelling that we did. So myself and a close colleague working for an Indigenous controlled law firm built a clerically verified, what's been referred to by population and demographic specialists as the gold standard of Indigenous population modelling in this country, and actually in the world for Australian Indigenous people, is sitting on a server in Sydney where only one person can access it. Only one person. So while I was working on it, we did our best to redistribute as much of that information as possible to descendants. But now that I no longer work for that organisation, that initiative has been arrested. So there's no overarching national kind of framework that would require organisations such as the NLA or such as that law firm to do anything about Indigenous access or control of that sort of information. Yeah.
Suppose an institution did have a data set that would be of interest, what would be the steps they would need to take to make the Indigenous data network aware of that? So how would they proceed?
We'll make contact with us in the first instance. And then we have a protocol for how we would be able to track down the owners of that information. And keeping in mind that Indigenous proprietary culture is a hereditary one, so it's very easy in most cases, once you have sufficient population data, to be able to find out who the owners of a data set actually are.
Hi James, I'm Ingrid. And I really have enjoyed your talk because I've had, I guess, a dilemma having worked in national research infrastructure for a decade now between the world of licensing and particularly Creative Commons licensing, which is used a lot in the cultural sector and also in the research sector, and some of these considerations that you're raising. So I wondered if you had come across some of the work that's been done across the Tasman to counterbalance fair with care. Care being collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility and ethics. And whether you think this is something that we here in this part of the world can contribute to the global conversation.
Yes, fantastic, and I'm glad you raised that because I actually missed part of my initial slide, which was to recommend to everyone that they find themselves a copy of Professor John Taylor and Tahu Kukutai's 2016 Indigenous Data Sovereignty. And in addition to that, as a precursor, before the Indigenous data sovereignty discourse had been properly developed, Professor Marcia Langton's and Martin Nakata's 2005 volume, Indigenous Knowledge and Libraries. Those two texts in particular contain texts by some leading experts in this space whose investigations actually inform a lot of what I've just been talking about.
Hello, my name is Jane Hunter from University of Melbourne. I did a project a couple of years ago with Paul Memmott from the University of Queensland and Carol Gossam, and we were trying to identify regional demand for particular housing services. And the big problem we had was that most of the data sets that we were using, a lot were from organisations such as the ABS or government departments. And the data is extremely sparse, particularly in regional and remote areas. And one of the issues is that many Indigenous communities don't trust the government agencies collecting the data, and so they don't always give precise, accurate data because of the mistrust. And so the data sets we're trying to work with to improve services are very poor quality. So how can we improve those data sets to provide better, more cost-efficient, effective, targeted services based on demand?
Fantastic question. It's potentially has a very complicated answer. You know, at a general level, I would say that the answer comes from the way you organise your relational data handling infrastructure, so that triangulation with other data sets will clear up those issues with very few problems. The challenge there is political, not technical. So once you have other data sets that you can triangulate for that same community, that same population, your poor data quality or the absences, the spaces in that data set will be filled by other sources. But the mechanism by which you do that and the mechanisms that allow for Indigenous control of that triangulation process, that matching, are critical. Yeah.
Thank you, James, for a fantastic presentation. Putting this into the international context, I wondered if you were doing, the Indigenous Data Network were doing work with other communities where there are similar data sovereignty or data repatriation communities. For example, I think of in Europe we have the European Holocaust Research Infrastructure, where they've done a lot of work around data, and in DARIAH we're doing some work about migration as well. And because of migration in Europe, a lot of data is collected, but how can that be transformed into sort of post-custodial, where the data comes back and people who are in new places can also contribute to cultural heritage in this way. And I just wondered if you work with other international organisations or whether you'd be interested in this particular area. No,
thank you. That's a fantastic question. We would be very interested. Australia, being Australia, we're always 10 or 20 years behind, particularly New Zealand, but also the rest of the world. We would warmly welcome that kind of an initiative, that relationship building initiative. Yeah.
Well, I want to see if there's any questions for James right now. We might warmly thanks, James.
All right, thank you.
Okay, so to James Smithies. James is Director of the King's Digital Lab and Deputy Director of E-Research at King's College London. He's author of The Digital Humanities and the Digital Modern. His doctorate is in the history of ideas, and he has published across a range of subjects including digital humanities, digital archiving, literary history and the history of computing and technology. He has lectured in digital humanities, history, English and philosophy, and worked as a project manager and senior business analyst in the government and commercial IT industry in New Zealand and the UK. From 2011 to 15, James was senior lecturer in the digital humanities and associate director of the Seismic Digital Archive at the University of Canterbury, New Zealand. Please welcome James to the podium.
Thank you. Well, it's nice to be back on this side of the world. People can understand my accent a little bit better. I think this talk might work okay without slides. But as James was talking, I was sort of thinking to myself, I'm going to talk today about King's Digital Lab, which is a lab that I designed and implemented at King's College London. And I designed it in Australasia, interestingly enough, over about 10 years when I was working at the University of Canterbury and having a lot to do with the Australasian digital humanities community. I sort of developed the ideas, my ideas about what a digital humanities lab might look like, didn't have the opportunity to implement it properly and got that opportunity at King's. So really what you're going to see today is sort of my thinking about what a digital humanities lab should look like. But unfortunately it hasn't been implemented in Australasia. And when I sort of thinking through James's talk, the thing that's missing in King's Digital Lab is the post-colonial moment. Sometimes I think that the post-colonial moment has sort of passed UK and Europe by. There's a lot of sophisticated thinking that sort of gets lost in the migration to Europe, or certainly got lost in the migration of my ideas to Europe. So that's a potentially really valuable point of dialogue, I think, between DARIAH and Australasia. But anyway, so my background is the history of ideas, literature and technology. But I've become fascinated by what I term the collision in digital humanities and e-science generally, between our inherited analogue traditions and the engineering and mathematical principles that enable and constrain computationally intensive research and digital product development. Reconciling these two aspects is a generational challenge. Reconciling these two aspects of contemporary research experience in an intellectually satisfying way. So I'd say that a reconciliation has occurred between the analogue and the digital, but as a historian of ideas, I'm not satisfied with it. And that's the focus of my recent book, The Digital Humanities and the Digital Modern. It's an attempt to rethink our assumptions about the digital humanities by considering them in relation to what sociologist Anthony Giddens refers to as second or reflexive modernity. That is to say, I think it's obvious that digital humanities are, to some degree, an expression of something we might call the digital modern. And a full understanding of them requires an understanding of their relationship to that wider context. Perhaps more radically, though, I claim that the defining aspect of the digital humanities is, or should be, or could be, the development of critical theories and methods that can help us both understand digital media and culture and build working digital tools and products as well. Now, this might sound trivial, but it's proving to be surprisingly difficult. My feeling is that most people underestimate the depth of the challenge. If we want to do it in sophisticated ways, we need to confront deep epistemological and even ontological issues related to our experience of the world, the limits of mathematics and computing, and what post-phenomenologists like Donald Ide would refer to as our entanglement with technological artefacts. So we need to find ways to integrate digital humanities into the deep history of the humanities at the level of epistemology and method. And once again, the core problem is how to develop critical theories and methods that can help us both understand the digital world and engineer working digital products. At the moment, we have to use two different languages to do those two different things. I have to use a certain language when I go to the library and another language when I'm in the lab. And I might be tilting at windmills, but I'd like to find a language that can do both. So one of my long-term projects is to explore the longue durée of machine epistemology in an effort to understand how humans have used machines to construct meaning over millennia. So this slide shows the Antikythera mechanism, which is an ancient Greek computer, and a supercomputer, the IBM Blue Gene, and an Amazon Echo. So in doing so, by charting the epistemological cultural history of machines from early Greek computers to Chinese water clocks, supercomputers, and our current fascination with products powered by so-called artificial intelligence, I hope to be able to better contextualise our current efforts in digital cultural heritage, digital humanities, and digital social science. And despite what some critics of digital humanities might think, humans have used machines to explore the nature of their worlds for millennia. And by recovering that history, we'll be better positioned to increase the sophistication of digital humanities as a field. So that's by way of background. I'm arguing that we need to do more than just engineer infrastructures and engineer labs. We also need to understand the deep historical context that our current generation are working within. So why focus on laboratories in this talk, though? In many ways, it's a side project to try and help me understand what's happened to me, the experiences that I've had in the last 4 years. It's a way to help me ensure that I think about the development of King's Digital Lab, or KDL, in a critical way. Because the interesting thing for me as a historian of ideas is that the concept of a laboratory didn't, of course, evolve fully formed. The scientists didn't always have them, and the contemporary form of laboratory we know today took over 100 years to evolve. So scientists have had 100, 150 years to evolve their notion of what a laboratory is, and humanists have really had 5 or 10 years. We're having to work it out now. And as with our general attitudes to machines, the better we understand the nature of our laboratories, ideally by studying existing examples, the better our labs and the meaning and knowledge they produce will be. So this sort of historical contextualisation is all an effort to increase the quality of knowledge that's produced from our laboratories and our digital humanities efforts. And the more I think about it, the more I think the era of natural philosophy can inform our activities. So this talk, one version of this talk, is called The Epistemology of the Machine, Natural Philosophy, Digital Laboratories and Cultural Heritage. I'm trying to sort of string those 3 ideas together. The more I think about it, the more I think the era of natural philosophy can inform our activities and connect us to long-standing humanities traditions in epistemology and method. I want to make sure that the epistemologies and methods that are instantiated in our lab in London have a continuity back to natural philosophy, that we don't sort of create labs out of time as if there's no connection to the longer history of knowledge. The word laboratory was first used by Ben Jonson in a masque performed at the court of James I in 1610, in which Mercury drives alchemists out of a laboratory in favour of Prometheus, nature, and 12 sons of nature. So laboratories were integral to the development of natural philosophy during the Enlightenment and fundamentally entangled with the development of experimental science in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. Drawing on a flowering of activity in these so-called mechanical arts across Europe, Francis Bacon famously recommended to Queen Elizabeth I that she establish libraries and zoos and botanical gardens to better understand the natural world. And these prototypical laboratories took the alchemical tradition, where people attempted to turn base metals into gold, and reoriented them towards mathematically grounded methods based on observation and repeatability. So Bacon described the rationale for this in one of the foundational texts of modern scientific method, Novum Organum of 1620. There's a quote on the screen now, and it reads, "We must not only search for and procure a greater number of experiments, but also introduce a completely different method, order, and progress of continuing and promoting experience. For vague and arbitrary experience is, as we have observed, mere groping in the dark, and rather astonishes than instructs. But when experience shall proceed regularly and uninterruptedly by a determined rule, we may entertain better hopes of the sciences." And I would add a caveat to that I'm hoping that quote shocks humanists in the audience, because there's something here about implementing laboratories and this association with science and determinism, technological determinism. What are we doing? You know, I go to London and I get given great amount of resources to implement this laboratory in the heart of an arts and humanities faculty. There are a range of implications that stem from that I feel a certain responsibility to. So in the centuries that followed Bacon, laboratories became what one commentator has referred to as the myth-laden headwaters of scientific knowledge, where methods like these were deployed in increasingly controlled, clean environments enabled by a mixture of tools and methods. Andrew Pickering's claim that laboratory method is as much performance as process is telling. Laboratories have come to symbolise not only science, but a mode of techno-scientific instrumentalism that lies at the heart of modern industrial capitalism. And this is, of course, in tension with the values of many humanities researchers. But it's important not to get drawn into simplistic definitions of a laboratory, assuming they lead inexorably, or worse, deterministically, towards empirical and instrumentalist modes of research. Robert Kohler and other historians remind us of labs' rich history, from river barges and herbariums to modern sites like CERN, as well as genomics, engineering, and all manner of other forms. There is no such thing as a standard laboratory, and never has been. There's this slide, there's a range of pictures of different laboratories, so 19th century river barges and herbariums. There's also, I don't know if you've seen that, saw that meme of Ivanka Trump in 2018, and it's Ivanka Trump saying, "I am sciencing," holding a beaker. Right. Yeah. So Ivanka Trump's attempt to cash in on simplistic articulations of laboratory research last year suggests something of the politics here. Real scientists voiced outrage at a stage-managed photo op and pointed out the radical heterogeneity of their research methods. Humanities laboratories have an infinite range of methods at their disposal, from the rigidly empiricist to the experimental and creative. More significantly, in terms of the history of ideas, laboratories allow us to engage with research methods and broader currents in epistemology that reach back to the Enlightenment and beyond. What we make of that is up to us. So the big risk that humanists can make is assuming that laboratories instantiate a narrow form of scientific method or research method. But what does that mean in practical terms for labs like King's Digital Lab? KDL evolved out of 30 years of activity at King's College. I've actually recently learned that they started doing digital humanities at King's College in the late 60s, so there's a long tradition of it. Against a background of rapid innovation and change in first humanities computing, then digital humanities. And this was initially based around the Centre for Computing in the Humanities in 1991, Harold Short and co, and later the Centre for E-Research in the Humanities, which is established in the IT department around 2006-2008. But in recent years, it's become increasingly apparent how difficult it is to undertake intensive software engineering inside an academic department. So the history of DH at King's, you sort of need the slide for this one. The history of DH at King's is that you get, in the late 90s, you get this little software engineering team that start to do a little bit of teaching, and then the DH boom happens around 2006, and everything expands. So they now have got something like 400 students, and we inherited 100 projects from them. So they just found it difficult to maintain that scale. So problems emerged related to project management, financial control, infrastructure, human resourcing, and quality control. We're talking about the evolution of the digital humanities from a server under the desk to something approaching what I'm referring to as industrial scale, with all the negative connotations of the word industrial. This is digital humanities at scale. And King's Digital Lab was established in late 2015 to fill this gap and given a mandate to consciously explore what it means to a humanities-based digital research laboratory. So at King's, I guess in sum, we've got a digital humanities department that now has 40 staff, 500 students, and it just became too difficult to do the software engineering within the academic department. So they took the software engineering team out of the department, put them into a standalone lab. So we're established late 2015. We're supported by external funding, but we're underwritten internally, so all the staff are permanent. We have 12 permanent staff, director, deputy director, project manager. We have 3 research analysts, 4 software engineers, 2 UI UX developers, a systems manager, a contract analyst, and we also have research fellows and research affiliates. In 2015, when I started, I'm quite proud of this, we had 6 men and 1 woman. We've now got 6 women and 8 men, 5 women and 8 men. So we're doing quite well with gender diversity, a lot of work still to do. 9 countries of origin, 11 languages. This is Europe, is a really diverse team. We manage quite a significant infrastructure for a digital humanities team. It's not much in comparison to STEM, but we manage about 200 virtual machines on our own rack infrastructure. We have about 1 terabyte of RAM, 50 terabytes data storage. We inherited 100 projects, and we manage about 5 million digital objects. So it's one of those weird things where, in terms of e-research as a whole, it's a tiny infrastructure, but in terms of digital humanities, it's quite significant. So we exist to increase digital capability across the Faculty of Arts and Humanities with a special sort of dotted line relationship to the Department of Digital Humanities. We underpin digital capability across arts and humanities, but also social science and public policy to some degree. I'm not going to get into the range of projects that we're involved in. Our last sprint, I was a bit dismayed to hear this because we're trying to keep the projects that we work on to sort of 2 or 3 every 2-week sprint, technical sprint. We had a technical sprint a couple of weeks ago. There were 35 projects being worked on at the same time. So demand management has turned into a bit of a problem for us actually. But we're involved in a really wide range of digital cultural heritage projects, from legacy projects we've inherited, so we do quite a lot of maintenance. We have to do a lot of maintenance. Historical databases, archive development, now mobile apps, big data analysis, visualization. We're starting to get into augmented reality as well. So we sort of run the full gamut of digital humanities development. In order to control this, we need to improve our project management. Actually, it's one of these sort of iterative things. As we scale, we need to increase the support that we provide ourselves. But we've developed a bespoke software development lifecycle based on agile methodology, tweaked for a research context. It covers everything from pre-grant analysis to archiving and research data management. Basically, our bread and butter is to meet with academics who want to put in a grant proposal with a digital component. Our analysts will meet with them, advise them on research tools and methods, define their technical requirements, write a prose overview that they can plug into their grant proposal, provide some costs, and provide some sort of forward planning around what will happen with that product or database after the funding's finished. And once they've got their funding, they come back to us and we build it. That's basically what we do. We're involved in 85 ideas last year and 35 grant proposals. So it's quite an intensive little team. The slide I was going to show now is just a screen grab of our project management tool, showing some of the projects we're working on. We're involved in £26 million worth of funding bids and over 35 grant submissions last year, and we work on 6 to 10 projects at any one time with mainly King's PIs, but also the London Cultural Heritage organisations and universities in Europe, the US and the UK. So it's a significant management task just keeping everything on track. And this is where that collision I was referring to earlier happens. Between the industrial management methods we need, that collision is between the industrial management methods we need to use to manage complexity, sort of the engineering complexity, and the intellectual and research cultures we exist to support. And to me, that's less a troubling tension, though, than the very basis of our existence. This way, the lab exists to reconcile this tension between, to put it crudely, Silicon Valley engineering methods and humanist research methods. So the next slide is our technical stack, which techies might be interested in. But that attempt to manage complexity and ensure continuity with our scholarly traditions extends right down to the way we've defined our technology stack. We didn't have any sort of control over our technology estate when I started. We used heterogeneous technologies. We were maintaining 20-year-old systems. It was a bit of a nightmare, actually. It's taken us 3 years to wrangle that into shape. But now we try to think about everything we do, from the type of machines and operating systems we use to the programming languages we invest in and the data models we develop. And ideally, they'll all be appropriate to our research context. They're our equivalent of flasks and beakers and centrifuges. So when we look at our documentation for our lab that has the programming languages that we use and the databases and the information architectures and data models that we implement, we view those in epistemological terms and we try and align them to our values as humanists. So we don't just choose technology stack that is the coolest thing out of Silicon Valley. we think about the technologies and how they match our research environment. So now I think I've reached the point where I can ask that question, and I think I've sort of got an answer to it. What is a digital humanities or social science lab, and how might we try to understand them? This is my big thing at the moment. We shouldn't just be implementing labs. We should be giving ourselves the critical tools to contextualise them properly and deploy them appropriately within our research culture. So I view KDL as a socio-technical system where research, computing, engineering, infrastructure and business collide. The big mistake that digital humanists have made over the last 20 years is only seeing the research side of the coin, and basically sort of being in denial about the fact that if you're going to implement a research lab, you also have to deal with finance, you also have to deal with software engineering processes, you also have to deal with operations and HR. And it's actually all of those issues in the round and the sort of big soup of the lab that is where the sort of the intellectual tension and the intellectual value, the real intellectual value of labs resides. So we need to read the lab, and I try to read our lab from a variety of SDS, science and technology studies perspectives. We need to read the lab in terms of the history of technology. We need to remember the material engineered reality of the lab. We need to think about the computers, the wires and the boxes, and we need to remember how they are connected to and are influenced by a global history of computing that reaches to Silicon Valley and beyond. And there is a lot of inertia from Silicon Valley and from industrial computing into our lab. And we have to mediate that. It's our job to mediate that and sort of be gatekeepers and protect our colleagues, if you will, or have a conversation between industrial computing and our colleagues and mediate for them on their behalf. We also read it in terms of the social studies of science, so that we think about the constructed nature of the lab, the way it's been consciously designed. And it's one thing I'm proud about KDL, is that it has been consciously designed. It hasn't just evolved because government has said, you shall start doing techie stuff. It hasn't just evolved because people have, sort of servers under the desks have proliferated and we've had to manage it in some way. We've actually stepped back and engineered it and implemented it in a really critical and conscious fashion and deployed it into our faculty. So it's evolved under the pressure of not only intellectual concerns but also administrative and financial. And this ethnographic view of the lab emphasises the role of people and the tacit knowledge that they have in shaping the everyday life of the lab. One of my goals is to get a digital ethnographer into the lab for about 2 or 3 years and just have them study us in the same way that Latour studied science labs. And we should be doing that ourselves. And I think we can go further and assert that the lab can only be properly understood if we properly understand the phenomenological entanglement of KDL staff with the infrastructure and machines, and my entanglement with the administration and finances that we use on a daily basis. So there's a picture that I wanted to show of just the lab, and there's lab members that are stand up. Now the people in the lab are critical. They're tied to these machines and the infrastructure through rituals of maintenance. We have to water and feed the computers. We have to keep up with the latest technologies. And they're limited in the research questions they can ask or enable because of the tools, the flasks and beakers and infrastructure that we've chosen to deploy in the lab. So at this point, the issue devolves towards epistemology. The nature of the knowledge creation process is instantiated in the lab, and the quality of the truths, with a big T and air quotes, or understanding or meaning generated within it. So what should we look for in our socio-technical humanities laboratories? How do we interpret digital laboratories when we encounter them? I think we should be looking And this is following Karen Norsatina and Peter Crowe's. I've got some quotes up on these slides. We should be looking for local instances of knowledge production. And that's, I love James's talk because it was so clear that the laboratory science, if you will, or laboratory research that James is involved in is very local. Indigenous knowledge is so peculiarly Australasian in some senses. But those local instances of knowledge production are tailored to different contexts, scales, financial models, circumstances, and methodological traditions and research interests. We should be looking at how different laboratories treat their digital tools and methods. How do they deploy their flasks and beakers? What flasks and beakers have they chosen? Have they chosen Windows because the CIO has forced it upon them? Or are they empowered enough to be able to choose open source tools because they think it's more appropriate for the research communities? How are they changing traditional functions of computers to suit humanities and social science research? Or are they? Or are they just letting the computers lead their research methods? And these sorts of questions should alert us to how the material reality of a given digital laboratory is entangled with the humans who use it and the administrators who provide the resources and, to some degree, determine the shape of the lab. But most importantly, it should indicate the agency of the humans in the socio-technical loop. In KDL, we've been given an enormous amount of agency. I'm constantly surprised by how much free rein we're given. Other labs I've seen are more clearly, sort of much more locked down and restricted in what they can and can't do, what projects they can run, what tools they can use. And it's this continuum from service unit to laboratory. And it's something that I've pushed back against over the last 3 years, is this drift towards being a service unit and just a weird development team. And the way to safeguard yourself against that drift to being just a service unit is to exert intellectual pressure on this notion of a laboratory and ask what laboratory means, because it implies epistemology, method, and a sort of a critical understanding that's completely absent in IT and in service-oriented laboratories. So once we understand the basic socio-technical structure of our digital laboratories, we should start to explore how they influence the research questions we ask, the problems we explore, and the problems we choose not to explore. Joan Fujimura offered an interesting way to look at this issue in a classic 1987 essay on so-called doable problems in cancer research. Nice diagram on the screen that you can find online. Fujimura was working after the first wave of work in the sociology of laboratory science that started in the 1970s with the likes of Bruno Latour. And her insight was that experienced laboratory scientists were very good at quickly determining which experiments would yield the most value to them and which weren't worth undertaking, however much they might be of interest. It's a key insight into the pragmatic reality of laboratory research. Rather than being sites of pure research, as much as I wish our lab was a site of pure research, labs are constrained by a complex set of socio-technical realities. And revealingly, for digital humanities labs, Fujimura points out that technology alone cannot make problems doable. Doability is better conceptualised as the alignment of several levels of work organisation. So rather than merely doing experiments that are of interest, successful laboratories conduct experiments that are aligned and possible because of that to their social world. So in KDL's case, we need to align to the Faculty of Arts and Humanities and Social Science and Public Policy, but also more remotely informatics, health sciences and education. We have to make sure to some degree that we're doing work that our paymasters want us to do, frankly. We also have to, any work or project that we undertake also has to align to the laboratory itself, and in particular the range of experiments already or historically carried out in the laboratory, resulting in the tacit knowledge that informs new one. So you don't go to a genomics laboratory and ask them to do high energy physics, obviously, but the same's the case within digital humanities. You come to our lab and you can do historical prosopographies, and in fact we've got quite a broad range. There's a lot of stuff we can't do, and we'll point people towards other labs who have capability in different areas. We also need to align ourselves to the experiment itself. In our case, the availability and tractability of data or content for digitisation, infrastructure, and the programming frameworks, tools and sets of tasks that need to occur for the experiment to occur or the tool to be built. So we get about 3 requests for new project ideas every week, and the only way we've come across to manage that is just to get the whole team in one room and discuss them one by one and look at each of these projects and work out whether they're doable from a strategic point of view, from a financial point of view, from a technical point of view, from a workload point of view. We align these different levels of work organisation collectively. Each digital humanities laboratory will have a different range of doable problems. We sort of inherited ours, and this is one of my key messages, I suppose, that if you're thinking about digital humanities laboratories in this way, there's sort of 2 ways to go. Either you inherit your capabilities and are sort of constrained by them in the way that we are, or you have a blank canvas and you think critically about the kind of affordances that you want to design into your lab. But either way, you're going to have some constraints. So my last lab in New Zealand was small and had limited capabilities. We specialised in born digital archiving of post-disaster content, could do a little around the edges related largely to teaching basic text analysis or web development, but any other work was unthinkable without significant additional investment in staff and infrastructure. KDL has a significantly larger range of doable problems, but we're actively investing time and resource in extending our capabilities into areas like augmented reality, virtual reality and visualisation that are on the border of our social and laboratory worlds. So last slide. Some tentative thoughts based on 4 years with KDL. And this is, it might show my tightly wound conscience, but I'm a historian by training, and I take really seriously the importation of technical tools and methods and laboratory methods into the humanities. It has massive epistemological implications. There's been a lot of pushback against the digital humanities, and frankly I think that we need more of it, because that's a point of greatest intellectual tension, and it's what we should all be focusing on. It's actually where the rubber hits the road, and it's why we should be investing in digital humanities, because there's a lot to explore. But anyway, digital humanities imply ethical as well as epistemological and methodological load. So we have an ethical duty to continue the humanities tradition as traditionally conceived. I don't think that digital humanities laboratories should create a rupture in the epistemological and methodological traditions of the humanities, even going back to natural philosophy. We've got a responsibility to sort of mediate that transition, as difficult as it may be. We've got an ethical duty to avoid the replication of the inequities of the tech sector culture. If we are going to implement labs within faculties of arts and humanities, we need to invert a lot of the cultural dynamics of the tech sector and show that technology doesn't determine human use. Labs that are instantiated or are developed within humanities faculties can show quite the opposite. We have an opportunity to show that humans are in control of technology and can deploy them as we see fit. We also have, and this is something else I think humanists aren't often aware of as much as we should be, we have an ethical duty to manage our financial responsibilities transparently and perhaps even aim to profit, in consciousness of the opportunity cost for our colleagues. Every new software license that I buy is a potential teaching assistant. Well, I'll go on through my list. We have an epistemological duty to safeguard but also extend the modes of knowledge creation and interpretation open to humanities researchers. We have a methodological duty to be experimental and innovative and embrace the possibilities of failure, but also be transparent about those failures. And finally, we have an epistemological and methodological duty to embrace the full spectrum of meaning construction in the humanities, from deformance to empiricism. So we need to push back against this assumption that instantiating laboratories means empirical research. It can also mean play, failure, and experimentation.
Thank you, James. Great to see my discipline at the forefront of your paper. It's marvellous. I'm sure all the historians in the audience agree. So I'll just take a few questions there and on the back. There. Sorry.
That's really interesting. My name is Patricia Murrieta. I'm the co-director of the Digital Humanities Hub at Lancaster University. I was wondering about the last part that you were talking about in terms of you know, creativity, but also allowance for failure and so on. I think in the humanities in general, we are very tight in terms of, you know, what constitutes a project that is actually successful and what constitutes failure. And in that sense, linking to student experiences, for instance, could you expand into what is the work that you do with the students in the lab and whether that, you know, teaches them as well to be creative and to fail when they have to?
Good question. So we don't have many students in the lab. That's actually the next thing on my to-do list, is to start involving students in the lab a little bit more. But I will say that my last university in New Zealand, I used to teach failure through project management. I mean, I think most people who have been involved in IT projects know that failure is naturally going to be a big part of it. So I used to teach project management through the sort of philosophy of failure. Project management's all about managing failure, large and small, isn't it?
I've just got a question about risk. I suppose I've seen a lot of digital projects sort of come and go, and I think for a lab like yours where you're building things for people, all of the grant money tends to be in the building stage and, you know, let's build something new, let's get it going, but there's never any money provided to operationalise what might be a database or a service. And so I'm just concerned about the risk you might face about managing a whole range of legacy projects for which there is actually no funding, and whether that starts to consume more and more of your time.
Excellent question. So part of the reason the lab was set up was to manage that specific issue. So when we started, I inherited 100 digital projects that have been built over the last 15, 20 years. All of them were out of funding, built with heterogeneous technologies. None of them were under maintenance. And we spent the last 3 years wrangling them into some semblance of shape. We've archived some of them. We've got 50 under service level agreements, and we're developing a cost recovery model for them. But on the basis of that experience, we've integrated research data management and application and system lifecycle management into our SDLC. And it all comes down to the initial requirement solicitation meeting between the analysts and the PI. In the last generation of DH, people, I think, just hoped that something will happen, and when the funding ends, things will be, somebody will rescue us. Nobody's rescued anybody. So we have that difficult conversation on day one now, and we talk about, we try to get them to think through the nature of their digital product and how long they really want it to keep going. What we've found is that probably 30% of projects should be kept going in perpetuity. They might be national collections or something of that nature, but actually for the other 70%, they probably need to definitely go sort of 5 years after the initial funding's finished, maybe 10 years. But after that, the PIs would rather that they were gracefully archived in some way, the data was made available and they can get on to the next project. So I think this is about, we're at an inflection point where the DH community needs to start taking a different approach to what quality means in terms of digital product development. In the last generation, we didn't when we were assessing a digital project for quality, we didn't include sustainability and archiving. We just assumed that it would go on forever, and I think we need to rethink that.
Thank you.
Thanks, James. That was really honest and detailed and very useful. And on that note, one of the things you said in your talk that I really appreciated was the comment that we need to focus on the deep historical context that our current generation are working in. I think that's a really forgotten aspect of all of this. But on that point, I'm wondering if you can maybe briefly elaborate on, if we're talking about generations and we're talking about context, we are talking about potentially PhDs and early career researchers who at some point soon will perhaps no longer see themselves as working in bespoke digital methods. They might actually just see that what they're doing is fully integrated into a humanities rather than a digital. So what then do these laboratories do in institutions? What role do they have to play?
It's a good question. I'm of the mind that, the digital methods, a lot of digital methods do get subsumed into mainstream humanities, but what we're finding is that there's always a cutting edge and then a bleeding edge of new technology that require labs like KDL. And for instance, we've been involved in a couple of projects recently with early career researchers going for fellowships, using natural language processing to analyse medieval texts in different languages and analysing Sanskrit and things. And those are just standard methods, but they need a lab to come to help them structure their project in a high quality way, to produce high quality knowledge. So I think in that sense, we're turning into a bit of a touchstone for researchers like that. But I'm grasping to say, I mean, that mythical early career researcher who has a full grasp of the research domain and the technical domain doesn't exist. So even the ones who have a quite advanced understanding of natural language processing in this example still want to work with our software engineers to optimise their techniques and move further into sort of push the technology beyond what they're capable of.
Hi, James. Thank you for sharing your experience, and it's very useful as running a lab. My name is Chao Sun. I come from University of Sydney. I'm the data scientist in the Faculty of Arts and Social Science, and I have been working 3 years like a tiny mini version of the lab, just by myself in the faculty. So I just have a question on how you normally run as a lab because in my understanding, doing digital humanity, it has two separate roles. One is for research in the humanity and how to approach a problem, and another part is the service where you have your existing typical methods and tools, and how much you, as a lab, you normally spend your time and workload into the research part by understanding the actual question and how to approach that and making humanity and social science values. And also when there's two similar projects, one you need to spend a lot of time in research and understand the question, and another one probably with equally financial return, but you have some established method and tools to deal with. How do you prioritize these type of research projects? Thank you.
So the prioritization of research projects, again, is done by our hive mind. I've got sort of final executive decision-making power over it, but the team really makes those decisions. And if we had two similar projects, quite often the cost efficiency improves, as you'll know, on secondary projects that are using the same technologies. So it's often more likely that we'll take on those secondary projects because we've got a better profit margin, effectively, or they're more sustainable. In terms of your first question, I sort of beg to differ a little bit in that in our lab, that process of mediation between the technical and research never stops. So it's really intensive in the first phase when our analysts are working with the PI and getting deeply engaged in their research project. But it continues right through to technical development when we're coding and coming up with quite specific technical solutions. But I agree with you, and I guess I've taken a slightly different approach. So we say that the whole software development life cycle includes little iterations between research and technical. It goes all the way through, right through to release and deployment. But what we've done in the lab is underpin that with an infrastructure and service layer that means that people don't need to stuff around with wires and boxes. So my vision for the lab was always that instead of turning up and stuffing around with wires and boxes and software and what have you, people could just turn up and there'd be an infrastructure and service foundation that would allow them to engage in advanced research methods. So I think it's a little bit of a misnomer. I think we need to provide that service layer, but that's incidental. That's like a science laboratory providing Bunsen burners and benches. It's the science that's done on top of that that's important, and it's at that level that we need. I think we need to get to a new. It sort of needs to be a step change in epistemology, actually, whereby we don't just do the analysis and then deliver a technical product. That it's sort of woven right through the process.
Thanks, James. Jane Simpson from the Centre of Excellence for the Dynamics of Language. I was really interested in the distinction you made in the answer to the previous question a couple of questions ago between archiving and making publicly accessible national collections. And I was interested to know what kind of infrastructure do you have in the UK, I guess, for the 30% of stuff that you want permanently accessible?
Yeah. The UK is actually going through a new sort of infrastructure renewal and road mapping process. So there's things happening in that space. To be frank, the kind of projects that fit that category that we inherited, there's probably only 2 or 3 of them, and we've instituted service level agreements that will support them for 2 to 5 years, and they just ideally will roll over, and I think that they will, but they're just supported by King's faculty on the basis that we've got moral, scholarly responsibility for them. But any new projects like that we're involved in, we start talking with the national institutions on day one and make sure that they've got a home to go to after us. And that might even mean designing the technology solution in a way that, for instance, better fits the National Web Archive or the National Archive so that we can do that migration. And this is me and my hobby horse, I suppose. I don't think that projects should get funding anymore unless their technical plans include that kind of forward planning in them, because it's irresponsible to use public funds for projects that don't have that kind of forward planning embedded in them.
Thank you. Look, we're at 12 o'clock, so I think we might leave it there. What a wonderful way to kick off our symposium. Thanks to both Jameses for their papers and great discussion. So,